What does victory sound like when it arrives not on hoof or foot, but on an endless mechanical tide? The first answer came as a distant, throbbing note engines. Then, more engines. A persistent, metallic heartbeat. Smoke curled low over the hedgerows, and the sea smelled of tar and fuel. Men on both sides turned toward that sound, and tried, at first, to measure it with old ideas. Klaus Müller, a junior officer watching from a sunken lane, wrote later that morning with hands that would not stop trembling. At 0900, I counted 117 identical reconnaissance cars streaming inland. They looked brand new. They were everywhere. A column of jeeps climbed a chalk rise, their silhouettes sharp against a gray sky. The image was not merely tactical, it was industrial. The machines arriving on Normandy sand were the visible tip of an enormous American production system. Landing ship tanks, the LSTs, disgorged dozens of vehicles at once, sometimes up to 30 per ship, and those ships came in endless convoys. A crane lowered a crate stamped with a factory code, and a mechanic checked a bolt, indifferent to the wind. To a German officer trained in conservation, the sight was disorienting. Where German doctrine prized repair and preservation, American planners had calculated a different geometry of war: produce massively, standardize ruthlessly, and accept loss as a variable to be managed. At peak output, American plants turned out jeeps by the minute. Parts were interchangeable, transmissions swapped as easily as shoes. An American mechanic unbolted an engine, hoisted it free, and slid in a replacement with practiced rhythm. Listen to a private's letter, scrawled late by lamplight in the 919th Grenadier Regiment. They ride everywhere, Lieutenant. They are like our cartridges used and thrown away. That mixture of awe and alarm threaded itself through German accounts. The jeeps were small, but their strategic consequence was immense. They dissolved frontiers, created improvised roads across fields, and gave ordinary infantry the mobility once reserved for armored corps. A jeep crossed a sunken lane, climbed a hedgerow, and vanished into a field. This was not merely more vehicles, it was a new logistical architecture. Ships carried finished machines, workshops trailed the columns, spare engines and transmissions were catalogued, boxed, and sent forward. The American calculation was simple. If a vehicle could be replaced faster than it could be expended, the battlefield became elastic. German commanders found that their carefully measured counters, bridges blown, ambushes staged, horses massed, no longer produced the pauses they expected. A supply truck rolled past, its canvas, belly full of labeled crates. By the time the sun lowered on that first intense day, the quiet terror among many German units was not the instant violence of a firefight. It was the mechanical relentlessness. The sound that had announced itself as a rumble had become, in men's minds, a verdict. The future of the campaign looked less like a series of battles, and more like an industrial argument laid plain across the fields of Normandy. How do you defeat an army that treats loss as part of production? The answer arrived not in doctrine, but in boxes and crated motors. A pier stacked with wooden crates, stenciled parts numbers, salt crust on a dockworker's knuckles. American factories, Willys Overland in Toledo, Ford in Dearborn produced jeeps by the hundreds of thousands. Between 1941 and 1945, over 640,000 jeeps left American lines. An assembly line blurred into motion. A worker tightened a bolt, then moved on. At peak, a new vehicle rolled off an assembly line roughly every 90 seconds. A German after-action report insisted this was not merely quantity but standardization. A transmission from a Ford fit a Willys in minutes, wrote a field officer. A transmission, greasy and smoking, slid into another chassis. Interchangeable parts meant that the battlefield itself became an extension of the factory floor. Mobile workshops trailed combat columns. Spare engines, transmissions, and boxed component sets moved forward on trucks and landing craft. LSTs disgorged up to 30 jeeps per ship, and those ships returned again, over and over. Men unloaded crates. A motor pool captain ticked off inventory on a small pad. American planners accepted attrition as inevitable, and designed for it. They estimated a Jeep's combat life at roughly 90 days, and planned production accordingly. Rather than repair everything in the field, they replaced whole units quickly. A damaged engine was unbolted and lifted out. A fresh engine took its place within the hour. German observers, hiding in hedgerows, recorded that replacement with a mix of disbelief and shame. "Our mechanics would require a week," one diary entry read. An engine hoist groaned. 2 soldiers grunted as they lowered a crate. The supply calculus was surgical. Statistical failure rates shaped spare part packages. Manuals printed on waterproof paper accompanied toolkits. Every motor pool had a catalog and a schedule. Where German units conserved, Americans dispersed. Where Germans assigned a vehicle to a unit for its lifetime, Americans regarded vehicles as consumables to be managed by inventory and transit. A clerk stamped delivery forms. A sergeant crumpled a used requisition. This system bore consequences that reached beyond convenience. Mobility multiplied tactical options. Reconnaissance could probe deeper. Artillery observers and jeeps relocated quickly, denying the enemy predictable targets. Supply lines became resilient, because replacements could flow faster than interdiction could cut them. German countermeasures mined roads, scorched bridges, ambushes, often found their effect neutralized within days. A bridge lay in splinters. Within hours, engineers set a portable span into place. Even cultural assumptions were shaken. German records noted African American soldiers working in motor pools, commanding vehicles, and supervising repairs. For men steeped in Nazi racial doctrine, the efficiency of mixed crews was a disquieting fact. Yet what unsettled them most was the arithmetic. Even massive losses could be absorbed by American production. The Jeep was no longer simply transport. It was a mechanical institution. An argument made visible across Normandy's fields. What does a front become when motion replaces position as its organizing principle? The answer arrived in small, bright flashes, headlamps cutting through mist, radio sets clicking like insect wings. A Jeep's radio squawked. A forward observer scribbled numbers on weathered paper. Men who had trained to hold lines now learned to move, and movement reshaped every decision. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schroeder, writing to his wife, tried to name the shock. "They fight a rich man's war," he said. "They waste vehicles, like we spend bullets." A ruined Jeep smoldered on the verge. Another vehicle already idled by to take its place. That comparative image, cartridges versus cars, hints at the inversion of resources and doctrine. German staffs counted conserved vehicles. American logisticians counted flows. The flows were deliberate, statistical, and relentless. Tactically, the Jeep multiplied eyes and hands across a vast front. Reconnaissance units could push farther, and scouts brought back shaped, immediate intelligence. A scout climbed from his Jeep, binoculars raised, breathing the damp earth. Artillery fire became mobile too. Observers in Jeeps would call coordinates, shift, and call again, turning targets into moving problems for defenders. Where German doctrine expected pauses for consolidation, American units simply reached around them. This flexibility created operational dilemmas that no single ambush or destroyed bridge could solve. Engineers unrolled a portable bridge. A column flowed across. Supply doctrine changed as well. Replacements did not trickle. They arrived in scheduled, cataloged shipments. Commanders who once feared a single gap in resupply found those gaps closing within days. A front that might have slowed under attrition instead stayed in motion. Crates stamped with part numbers were wheeled into mobile workshops. Planning moved from the intimate preserve this particular vehicle to the industrial. Sustain an aggregate rate of movement across weeks. Psychology followed logistics. German soldiers, trained to maintain and protect, watched Americans discard machinery, casually. Private letters and diary entries recorded a slow disbelief that hardened into resignation. "They replace engines in the field as if changing shoes," one mechanic wrote. A grease-stained hand wiped sweat. A young corporal lit a cigarette. That indifference to individual loss became, paradoxically, a source of strength. To the Americans, waste was an instrument, not a vice. Innovation fed this process. Field modifications multiplied quickly. Wire cutters welded to bumpers, extra armor bolted on, radios rearranged into mobile networks, medics converted jeeps into stretchered ambulances. Engineers mounted mine detectors and improvised tow rigs. Each adaptation was practical, immediate, and effective. Weld sparks flew, a stretcher slid into a modified chassis. The jeep's simplicity invited change, and the speed of change multiplied its battlefield value. By mid-June, German intelligence could only approximate the scale of the problem. Estimates of thousands of jeeps on the ground grew each day, and with them, a clear realization: the war's balance had shifted from craftsmanship to throughput. In that realization lay a bitter lesson. The enemy's advantage was not superior courage. It was a factory line that reached all the way to the front, a late-day horizon, flattened. Distant engines faded into evening. Dawn on a logistics pier smelled of salt, oil, and cedar dust, the scent of war arriving in crates. Cranes swung, hooks clinked, and wooden pallets bore stenciled part numbers. Men counted, stamped, and stacked with a mechanical calm that matched the factories back home. The process was simple and relentless. Build, box, ship, replace. A clerk circled quantities on a manifest. A sergeant tucked the paper into his pocket. American production was not an accident of scale. It was a plan executed with industrial precision. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 640,000 jeeps. At peak, an assembly line turned a vehicle every 90 seconds. An assembly worker tightened a final bolt and stepped aside as the next chassis rolled forward. Those numbers mattered in the field as much as tactics or maps. A single LST could carry up to 30 finished jeeps, and hundreds of such ships kept the flow steady across the channel. Landing ramps lowered, vehicles drove onto wet sand. German officers recorded the effect with a mixture of technical wonder and human unease. Major Heinrich Zimmermann observed that the American supply chain operates like a factory production line extended to the battlefield. A mobile workshop unfolded its awning. Men unboxed spare engines. Where German doctrine conserved and repaired, American doctrine replaced and moved on. Statistical failure rates dictated spare part kits, manuals printed on waterproof sheets, accompanied toolboxes, and mobile repair units followed close behind combat columns. The result was a battlefield that replenished itself faster than interdiction could disrupt. A field mechanic unbolted a damaged transmission and slid a fresh unit into place. The cultural implications rippled beyond mechanics. German observers noted African American soldiers working in motor pools, driving jeeps, and supervising repairs. For men steeped in Nazi racial theories, the efficiency of integrated crews was an unsettling, irrefutable fact. They operate and repair these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers, one officer scribbled with thin, disbelieving ink. A black mechanic wiped his hands and passed a socket to a white corporal. The presence of mixed crews undermined prejudiced assumptions, quietly demonstrating competence where ideology predicted failure. Field improvisation amplified production advantages. Units welded armor plates and fitted wire cutters to bumpers. Medics converted chassis into emergency ambulances. Engineers mounted mine detectors on leading vehicles. The Jeep's simple, modular design invited change and rewarded quick invention. Sparks flew as a welder attached a makeshift skid plate. A stretcher slid into a stripped-down rear compartment. Each modification multiplied tactical options and multiplied the Jeep's value beyond its manufacturer's blueprint. By mid-June, German intelligence offered uneasy calculations. Thousands of Jeeps on the ground, with hundreds more arriving each day. The arithmetic was stark. Even heavy losses could be absorbed within days, not weeks. Where German planning measured preservation, American planning measured throughput. These were not merely vehicles on sand and fields. They were the material expression of a national decision to convert industry into influence, and influence into movement. A long column of identical silhouettes rolled off into the horizon, engines steady as a heartbeat. The morning smelled of cold gasoline and wet chalk, a smell that spoke of movement rather than marching. A convoy slid off a spit of beach, tires hissing on sand. A crate of spark plugs thudded onto a pallet. Where once soldiers waited for orders, they now waited for wheels. The Jeep had not only altered tactics, it had rearranged expectation. Ernst Bergman, a captured radio operator later turned engineer, wrote in a cramped POW billet, "We learned in Normandy that factories fought as surely as men." I counted lines of identical cars and felt the ground itself change. His pencil left a dark smear on damp paper, a lamp guttered. That realization carried a moral weight. Industrial capacity could decide battles before boots struck earth. By June's second week, the numbers hardened into a strategic problem. American convoys had already landed thousands of vehicles. Reports from interrogation and aerial surveys placed vehicle counts in the tens of thousands as weeks passed. Maps marked supply routes. An officer traced them with a stub of pencil. The arithmetic terrified staff officers who had measured wars by regiments and brigades, not by assembly lines. If a front could be reconstituted faster than it could be broken, defense became a question of tempo, not position. Tactical consequences multiplied quickly. Reconnaissance jeeps probed gaps that doctrine had declared secure. Artillery forward observers, mounted in light vehicles with radios, called down accurate fire while keeping pace with advancing columns. A radio operator shouted coordinates. A shell bloomed on a distant hedgerow. Engineers bridged, blown spans within hours, and supply trains unfolded like clockwork behind them. Ambushes that once stopped advances now merely slowed them by hours. The system absorbed friction. The psychological dimensions were as real as the logistics. Private letters, once full of bravado, grew quieter and more precise. They replace engines like shoes, one mechanic wrote, and move on. A field workshop hummed. Men wiped grease from their faces. This casualness toward material contradicted German military culture. In the Wehrmacht, a vehicle was family logged, repaired, and kept. In the American force, it was a node in a flow. That flow reshaped grand strategy. German commanders found that concentrating fire on single convoys produced only local successes. Replacements arrived. Destroying a bridge bought hours, not weeks. Fuel shortages were less crippling when tanker trains and pipeline segments could be repositioned swiftly. The calculus of endurance shifted. Resilience now meant the ability to restore throughput rapidly. A long line of tankers unrolled hose to refill jerrycans. The longer shadow reached beyond Normandy. Officers who survived took lessons home. Post-war German industry would borrow American methods of standardization and interchangeability. Otto Schultz, later an engineer in rebuilt Germany, recalled how mass-produced adequacy had outstripped artisanal perfection on the battlefield. "We were craftsmen," he wrote. "They were managers of movement." A factory floor hummed in his memory. A conveyor moved parts like beads. In the final tally, the Jeep became more than a vehicle. It was a visible proof that modern war depended on the capacity to produce and replace, persistently and predictably. For men who watched those columns, each identical silhouette bore an unadorned message. The war could be remade, repeatedly, by those who could build faster than they lost. Evening engines faded. The line of lights marched like stars across the plain. What does the end of an age sound like, when its rhythms are overtaken by a factory's cadence? The answer arrived as a softer kind of thunder, trains loading, engines idling, a distant chant of rivets. A rail yard lit by sodium lamps, crates rolled toward waiting flat cars. Men who had measured war in careful maintenance logs felt the ground shift beneath them. Otto Schultz, years later, wrote from a prisoner's hut, in clear, economical lines. "In Normandy, we learned that the factory can fight as well as the soldier." The assembly line decided more than a battalion. His handwriting trembled where the ink had blotted. A lamp guttered. That confession folded into countless private notes and official reports. And it became the enduring argument of the campaign. Production as strategy. By late July, the arithmetic hardened. Operation Cobra and the subsequent breakout depended on motorization at scale. Reports counted vehicles in the tens of thousands. Commanders estimated that even catastrophic losses could be replaced inside weeks. Aerial photos showed endless dots turned to lines. Officers circled routes. The consequence was decisive. Mobility replaced massed position. Tempo outran attrition. Planners who assumed static defenses discovered movement's moral and physical leverage. Tactically, the Jeep's ubiquity rewired battle plans. Small units could appear, where maps promised no roads. Artillery could leapfrog forward. Forward observers called fire, moved, and called again, confounding countermeasures. A forward gun battery shifted position. A radio operator laughed softly at the speed. Each improvised success aggregated into operational momentum. The battlefield became elastic, and elasticity favored the side that could sustain it. There was also a human aftertaste to this industrial advantage. German troops reported a mixture of astonishment and bitterness. Letters show resignation, leveling into curiosity. "They waste," one corporal wrote, "and in wasting, they become unstoppable." A captured Jeep's glove compartment contained a soldier's cigarette case. A pocket watch ticked. That ambivalence haunted post-war memory. The presence of integrated crews, the improvisations welded on by soldiers, the casual exchange of parts, all these undermined earlier certainties about capacity and prowess. Longer term, the lessons spread. German industry, demobilized and rebuilding, borrowed standards of interchangeability and mass production for civilian life. The Beetle, the rebuilt factory floors, and the new engineering curricula all carried traces of Normandy's instruction. Otto Schultz would later supervise production lines with those lessons in mind. A modern assembly line hummed in his memory. Workers moved with, practiced calm. In the end, the Jeep story is not merely technological. It is moral and industrial, tactical and economic. It shows how a nation's choices about production become choices about life and death on distant fields. For the soldiers who watched those columns pour inland, each identical silhouette carried a single, unbearable message. The rules of war had changed. Engines slowed as dusk fell. Lights winked across the plain.